Thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's very good to be here in Madrid. Again, it's a city I visit actually quite often. I apologize for being completely unable to do my presentation in Spanish, and I appreciate the fact that I am allowed to come here and speak in English. I'm going to talk about the future, and the most important thing to say at the beginning is I don't know what's going to happen in the future. And unlike anybody, like many other people in economics, in international institutions, I don't pretend I know either, which is, I think, at least an element of honesty. So what I want to do is to explain how I think about the future, what seems to me a useful way of thinking about the inherently unknowable. The important thing I would add is that the fact that the future is unknowable and uncertain is, to my mind, pretty well what makes life bearable. Just imagine if you really did know what was going to happen next. I've always felt this must be an enormous problem for God. It must be just so boring. Now, I'm going to start with a quotation from, of course, our national poet, Shakespeare. This is from Hamlet, and it's about things that we know will probably happen at some point, but we don't know when or how. And that's an important theme of my talk. And what Hamlet says is, there is special providence in the fall of a sparrow. If it be now, 'tis not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. If it be not now, yet it will come. The readiness is all. And if there's anything that I want you to take away from my talk, it is really that idea. You have to be prepared for what you normally think of as unthinkable. Now, of course, there are some unthinkable things, I'm going to mention one or two, you can't think about, and above all, you can't be prepared for, because you simply cannot prepare for them. But there are many you can, and you have to think about this. So, what I want to talk about first is uncertainty. Then I'm going to divide what might happen, the possible events, into things that seem to me nearly certain. They're not absolutely certain, but nearly certain. Very high probability. And there are a few of them. The things that are more likely than not to happen. In some cases, considerably more likely than not. Some perhaps a bit more than 50-50. And then there are the really interesting categories, what I call the possible, or a more precise way of thinking about them, are things that are individually low probability, really quite low probability. We don't know what the probabilities are. They're certainly not zero. They have very high impact if they happen. And one or two of them, there is a long list, I have about 10, is almost certain to happen one way or another in the next 10 or 20 years. And we've just had two of them in the last 2 years. A pandemic and a significant war. Those are perfect examples of low probability events in any given period which will change the world. And many of these have happened, and I'm now going to talk about those. So if you look back over the last 40 years at the things that happened which nobody really thought were unimaginable at the beginning of each decade, in 1980, really, very few people, I can think of 3, thought the Soviet Empire would simply disappear, just disappear within a decade. It was unthinkable in 1980. In 1990, really few people, perhaps Deng Xiaoping thought it, that China will be an equal superpower or close to equal superpower with the US within 25 to 30 years. In 2000, basically nobody, well, in 2000, really very close to nobody, thought there would be a colossal transatlantic financial crisis that would take down the Western financial system, which had to be rescued by governments, and then go on to this enormous crisis in the Eurozone. In 2010, few thought the next huge economic crisis would be a pandemic. And in 2020, really few people thought that war, a major war, would break out in Europe within 2 years. The world is profoundly unknowable in detail, and you really have to expect the unexpected. I could have gone back through every previous decade of the last 200 years, and I would have similar examples. Dramatically so in the 20th century. So let me start by looking at what I think of as almost certain, the things you have to anchor yourself on as the likely background trends for the world economy and therefore for world politics too. I'm focusing on the economy in this part because that's what I know most about, but I think it also shapes so much of what happens, including the geopolitics. And those are demography, climate change, technological progress, economic growth. And let me just go through briefly these basic forces that shape our world. The almost certain, they're not fantastically unpredictable. We're in the middle of two huge demographic shifts, and barring some astonishingly big event, global thermonuclear war, I'm going to come to that, they're likely to continue. The first of these is, of course, the huge shift in the population balance of our world. And the most obvious part of that is the shift away from us, people in rich, high-income Western countries, to developing countries, and above all to Africa. So this is the population shares of high-income countries, of India, which is the very pale blue, of sub-Saharan Africa, which is purple, of China, which is dark blue, of the rest of East and Southern Asia, which is light green, and we're the high-income countries at the bottom. And back in 1960, a quarter of the world's population lived in high-income countries. Today, it's about 16%, and it's expected to fall further to 14% by 2050. Note the very rapid expected decline in the share of China in the world's population over the next 35 years or so, almost certain given its fertility rates. The really big shift on the other side is the rise of sub-Saharan Africa and India. Sub-Saharan Africa is expected to have 22% of the world population by 2050, and given fertility rates, that again is almost certain. So that's a transformation, very profound, which we can expect. The second big demographic change we can expect is aging. Again, barring some colossal catastrophe, not a COVID, but a multiple COVID, which kills off old people at a staggering rate, please God no, we can assume that most of the world is going to age, and some of the aging processes are dramatic. This just focuses what's happened between 1960 and 2018, with the red bar showing the old age dependency ratio back in 1960, and the purple bar showing the old age dependency ratio in 2018. And you can see for all the rich countries and China, this shift is very well developed and likely to continue. The two parts of the world where it hasn't really happened are South Asia, above all India and sub-Saharan Africa. India will age, but really quite slowly comparatively, and sub-Saharan Africa will also age, but also really slowly. Aging has happened, it will continue, but it is wildly divergent across the world, and given fertility rates, that is likely to continue, particularly with sub-Saharan Africa being especially young. The second really big thing is what's going to happen to the climate. And this shows the increase in atmospheric temperatures above pre-industrial levels by 2010, and then subsequently under 3 models. This comes from the IMF, what they call a high climate sensitivity, a medium climate sensitivity, and a low climate sensitivity. The medium is far and away the most likely. The really important point is by 2030 or shortly afterwards, we are pretty well certain to exceed the 1.5 degrees centigrade increase, which many scientists believe is already going to cause very significant unpredictabilities and instabilities in the world climate system. This is not just likely, it's almost certain. It's too late to stop this. And thereafter, in my view, we have to assume the rise will continue. And it will continue above all because what we do is now almost, what we in high-income countries do is almost irrelevant. We only generate a little over a third of the world's emissions, and all the growth is going to come from developing countries and emerging and developing countries, and their growth and emissions are not going to stop in the near future. By the near future, I think in the next 2 decades. China's commitments, for example, will certainly not lower the growth of their emissions in any significant way before the 2040s. So, climate change is baked in. It's near certain. The third big thing that is near certain is the world will become more interconnected. So this shows broadband subscriptions per 100 people from 1998 to 2017. And at the top of the chart, you know, it was in 2000, it was essentially 0. South Korea, Germany are pretty well at saturation, given there are children, there are more than one person in a household. US is a bit behind. The world is the second line from the bottom. And you can see the world is far below levels for South Korea or Germany. It is absolutely certain that those lines will converge, barring some extraordinary catastrophe. And over the next 10, 20 years, everybody in the world will be on broadband. We're all going to be more interconnected than humanity has ever been before. Personally, I find this absolutely terrifying, but it is where we are going, and we can assume it. It is not a low probability, it is nearly certain. And the final thing, where I'm a little more hesitant, but nonetheless pretty confident, is pretty confident, so 85 to 90% confident, is that the world economy as a whole will grow. So this shows global GDP per head at purchasing power parity. Don't worry about that. From a very famous research project by the British economist Angus Maddison, who died a few years ago. And it shows what has happened between, these are real terms, between 1900 and 2020. The first point is global real GDP per head increased 7 times between 1900 and 2020. Obviously, the most important single fact about our world is that. But the second point is that except between 1900 and 1920, when there was the little problem of the First World War intervening, in every decade, even during the Second World War, it has risen. Somewhere has been growing a lot. Every decade, even in the last lousy decade, because of China, because of East Asia, I'll come to this in a moment, growth has continued. And so we're now at 15,169 globally. By the way, the developed countries are about 3 times that on average. Obviously, many countries are much poorer. I'm going to come to that in a moment. But the crucial point is it is reasonable to assume, I'm not quite as confident of it as about climate and the internet, But it is reasonable to assume the world economy will go on growing because the growth engine we have created is fantastically powerful. It is the most important single economic fact about our world that our economies grow. Not all equally, but somewhere will grow very fast, and most economies will grow at least a little. And that has all sorts of implications for resource use, for the availability of resources, and so forth. But the other thing we can be really sure about is that this growth will be globally unequal. It will also be unequal in many other ways. I don't have time to discuss this. So this just looks at regional GDP per head, slightly different base number. This is 2017 purchasing power, not 2011. And it shows the region. So the red line at the top is the high-income countries, goes back to 1980, and it shows that the high-income countries' GDP per head, by the way, has gone up about 150% on average over the last 40 years. It's a semi-logarithmic chart, and that's the red line at the top. We're much richer than anybody else. That's what makes us high income. It shows actually that over the last 25 years, emerging and developing Europe has done very well. That's those are the light green line. And below that is Latin America, which has done really badly. It has grown, but very, very little. It's probably the most disappointing major region economically. I don't have time to discuss why. And below that, equally disappointing, is Middle East and Central Asia. And remember, sub-Saharan Africa is the light blue line. It's done a little, but its growth and its GDP per head has doubled since 1995, but overall it's been disappointing. The really big transformative factor, which I'm going to predict will continue, is Asia. In 1980, the average income of emerging and developing Asia was far and away the lowest of any major region in the world. That's the red line. And today, it's long surpassed sub-Saharan Africa. It's passing Middle East, and it's very close to Latin America. And it looks sort of unstoppable. It won't continue at that rate, of course. China's going to slow, India's going to slow, but it is almost certain, in my view, to continue. Not absolutely certain. And just to remind you, emerging and developing Asia is half of the world's population. So that's the second most important economic fact about our world, the rise of Asia, which I don't think, having worked in the bank, is stoppable. Now let me talk about probable things. I've already talked a bit about Asia. I just want to look at China, because it's not absolutely certain, but I think what I'm going to describe is right. I'm going to talk about deglobalization, which I think is very probable. I'm going to talk about virtual globalization, which is also probable. I'm going to talk about living with an enduring debt overhang. We have an enormous debt overhang in the world, which we can't get rid of except through catastrophic means. Global hyperinflation or catastrophic defaults. Those are low probability, not zero probability events. So we have to assume the debt is just with us. Continued low real rates of interest and a hangover from pandemic and Ukraine war, and finally more active government. Let me just go through these quickly. China's rise. I think China's economy is going to be as big or bigger than the US in nominal terms. It's already bigger in purchasing power parity terms by 2030. It will be smaller than that of all high-income countries together in 2030. But it clearly has the potential, I'm not sure quite how the probability is, but I would regard it as well above 50%, of being as big as all the high-income countries together, given its population. And this gives an indication of what this might mean. So these are the actual and forecast shares of world GDP of the euro area, which is in green, the US, which is in purple, other advanced country, which is in blue, China, which is red, India, which is light blue, and other emerging countries. The really big part of this story is that in 2000, the developed countries were nearly 80% of world GDP, and by 2030, it'll be down to a little over 50. In nominal terms, purchasing power parity is much lower, and China will be bigger than the US, or more or less exactly the same size as the US. These are quite conservative forecasts for China. I would regard them as really quite conservative, deliberately so. It could be much higher. The shift from the developed countries, above all to China, lesser degree India, is dramatic and ongoing, and it parallels the shift in population. That, I think, is highly probable, maybe even in my certain category, but I put it at sort of an 80% subjective probability. The second thing is we have to note that in terms of real goods and services, the globalization era is already really over. There was a period, the red line shows the average growth in the preceding 5 years of world trade, and the purple line shows the average growth of world GDP in the preceding 5 years. So you can see that since the peak in 2008, when the average growth in world trade in the preceding 5 years was 8%, it's more than halved. And for the last 10 years, 15, basically the average growth, well, the last 7 years, the average growth of world trade has matched that of GDP. It's not de-globalization, but it's the end of globalization in the sense of rapid integration of the world economy with trade growing much faster than GDP. That period is over, and I don't see anything in the horizon that will change that. The second thing is a particularly important form of globalization, which is the unbundling of supply chains and the global integration of supply chains, halted effectively in 2000, peaked in 2008. The one way of thinking about that is the blue column shows traditional trade as a percent of global GDP, and all the rest show different components, I won't go through them all, of value-added trade, trade within supply chains in the value-added chain. And you can see that between 2000 and 2008, that exploded. 2010, it exploded. We completely changed the nature of world trade through this unbundling of supply chains because of the complete confidence we had in the globalization process, and particularly the integration of China. Since then, this has just stopped. It has stopped growing. It's a particularly important component of world trade because it was the most dynamic part of world trade, whose opportunities seem to have been exhausted for various reasons. It's a very important global economic shift. Meanwhile, and I just want to do this, shows just one of innumerable platforms of web integration through face-to-face contact over the web, the move to what I call virtual globalization, or virtual integration, the way everybody conducts their meetings across the world now. Now, this is Microsoft Teams. I could use other ones. You can see that as a result of COVID, we really just jumped in technological adoption. It's one of the most exciting, remarkable episodes in the history of technological adoption. Suddenly we moved from basically assuming we should meet physically in offices, or if not, we got on airplanes and we traveled thousands of miles in order to meet people, and suddenly we got used to the idea we didn't need any of that. And that's a permanent shift. And it will have very profound effects on the way we organize businesses, the way we integrate with one another. And to stop this, you need two forms of protection. One, a language nobody else can use. which is, I'm afraid, why English has become a world language. We had to have one, right? So we had to have one, and for accidental reasons it ended up with English, or a government that is absolutely determined to block the internet. And there's only one that has been able to do this really well, and that's China. I don't think anyone else will. So virtual globalization looks really a certainty. Now, the third virtually certain thing is that COVID is going to end up with permanent losses in GDP, above all for emerging and developing countries. And this is a chart from the very latest IMF report on this, which shows that the red line is what the IMF thought potential output would be in emerging and developing countries, and the thick blue line, the non-broken blue line, is what the IMF thought would be the potential output of developed countries back in 2019, before COVID was ever even thought of. And the other two lines, the one with slightly longer little lines, shows the forecasts for October 2020, so after COVID, and the other one shows the most recent ones. The most important point is that the IMF expects, and it's consistent with performance, that the high-income countries will, on average, leaving aside the Ukraine war, regain their previous relatively slow growth trend. The emerging and developing countries will not, because of the way COVID has hit them and the mess we've made of global cooperation. It's a permanent loss to emerging and developing countries. That looks highly probable. Not certain, but highly probable. The other near certain, and it's a relatively near term, the next 2-3 years, I think, is we have a big inflation hangover from COVID, from the monetary policy mistakes made in COVID, and of course the consequence of the war, and the profound disruptions in the labor market that have gone with it. And the biggest hangover is in the US. This comes out very, very clearly in this, which shows, again from the recent IMF report, that forces other than supply shocks are at least as important in generating the very high inflation in the US as the sources from supply shocks. And that means it is almost certain not only that the Fed will tighten, but that it will go on tightening, and it will probably tighten more than most people think, and it's going to create a big global mess, given the debt, which I've already talked about, particularly in emerging and developing country debt. This is pretty well certain, I said. And, of course, any world in which dollar rates go up a lot, it won't necessarily transmit to other countries, but it's going to, we know that interest rates are going to rise elsewhere too. Long-term interest rates are certainly going to rise somewhat, at least in nominal terms. I don't have time to go into real terms, but I just want to indicate what this means in terms of debt vulnerability. I talked about this. This is certain. It's where we are. We have debt vulnerability. So this wonderful chart shows the ratio of sovereign debt to GDP across the world. The blue is the high-income countries, and the red is the emerging and developing countries. And it goes back to 1880. It comes from the IMF. I think it's fantastic, because what it says is we have in the developed countries and in the emerging and developing countries, the highest public debt levels relative to GDP ever. That is a source of obvious macroeconomic vulnerability. It's fine if interest rates remain very low, particularly low relative to potential GDP growth. Potential GDP growth in developed countries is modest. And if real interest rates get close to or higher than potential GDP growth, we're going to have some debt crises. It's nearly certain. And this shows The same thing, but going back to 1970 in a way, for all debt, for the whole world, divided into household debt, purple, the green is non-financial corporation debt, and the red is public debt. And the basic story is very simple. Basically, we have consistently raised the global debt ratio. I don't have time to go into why that happened, whose fault it is. And the last COVID crisis was spectacular. That's the last year is the COVID crisis in the jump in global debt. And by the way, the biggest component of that was the private sector component of that, above all the non-financial corporate component of that, is almost as big as the public component. So COVID's legacy includes an immense amount of debt. I don't think this was wrong, but it's a vulnerability. A crucial question then is, will real interest rates stay low or rise? And this is a very powerful measure of real interest rates. It's inflation-indexed rates, the real rate on inflation-indexed bonds for the US since 2003. And you can see they've been 0 to negative in the last few years. Nobody knows what's going to happen to these. The analytics are very complicated. But what is worth stating is that the real interest rates we've had in recent years, the negative real rates, are unprecedentedly low, almost certainly unsustainable. It is probable then that real interest rates will rise somewhat from where they are. Perhaps not a lot, but somewhat. And that will transmit, particularly in an inflationary world, into higher nominal rates, possibly considerably higher nominal rates, and make debt more fragile. So that's a highly probable thing. And then the very last highly probable thing is we're moved into an era of more active government, our era of deglobalization, our era of crisis, our era in which government is expected to come to the rescue is one in which things look very dangerous and governments are expected to help. But I'm also suggesting, given their debt burdens and other difficulties, they're going to find it quite difficult to help. So I would predict a lot of political stress associated with that in our countries and across the world. Now, Ronald Reagan said, and this really introduced the neoliberal era, as it's sometimes called, that the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." But government was asked to save us from the financial crisis. It rescued the whole financial system. Now governments, or pretty well, are saving us or have saved us through their involvement from the worst of the pandemic, including their role in promoting the vaccine solution. So today's Reagan's words just don't sound very credible. And the question is whether these governments will go away. Their ability to raise more resources are limited, but the demand for government action is enormous. So my guess is it won't go away. We're living in an era, probability again, of government activism. So I've discussed what I think is nearly certain, and I've discussed the risks particularly that seem to me highly probable. Now let me go through a very simple list, there's not much to be said about them, of things that are low risk individually. In any given year, they seem unlikely. They have tremendous impact, and it's really, given history, rather likely some of them will happen. And we've just had 2 in the last 2 years, and we don't know whether that's the end of it this decade. It might not be. So let me just go. There is one really nice possible low-risk event, a huge resurgence of global growth as technology really makes a transformative effect. I think that's a low probability event, really low probability, but it'd be a very nice one, provided we could manage it with environmental sustainability. It's not clear we can do that either. So what are the downside risks, the really important ones? A huge financial crisis. Well, given what I've talked about in the debt side and the real interest rate, that's clearly one. There's no question about that. That could easily happen. i.e. a bigger one than last time, one in which there are really mass defaults, including of sovereigns, a global depression associated with the huge financial crisis, because governments lose the ability actually to create resources that create debt which people will willingly hold. Real tipping points for climate. We will discover that actually, which is obvious, the climate system is not linear. It's highly non-linear, and that suddenly we find we're in a different world. The history of the planet suggests that happens. So we can pass a tipping point, and suddenly we're in a different world climate. And given what I've talked about, the climate trends, it seems to me very definitely an issue to consider. Associated with that, really serious floods of refugees. Really serious floods of refugees. More pandemics. I haven't got the time to show you this. There have been a lot of near pandemics in the last 20, 30, 40 years. And there have, of course, been vastly worse pandemics in the past. More pandemics in the next 10, 20 years? I think incredibly likely. Disintegration of the global economy as geopolitical forces tear us apart. Essentially the complete reversal of globalization. Not just the end of globalization, but radical deglobalization, probably into regional hubs. Catastrophic cyber attacks. Mega-terrorism. What do I mean by mega-terrorism? A terrorist that lets off a nuclear bomb somewhere. That's not inconceivable at all. Graham Allison wrote a book about it. War, even nuclear war. I don't really need to discuss that today, do I? Breakup of the EU, yeah, all thinkable. Constitutional collapse in the US. Revolution in China. You all smile. None of these is inconceivable. The US, in my view, is very close to it. So, think about the low probability, high impact events. Could you survive them? No, you can't survive a nuclear war. Don't bother thinking about it. So thinking 10 years ahead is hard, but some things seem quite certain, and I've already detailed what they are. I won't go through them again. Some things seem pretty well baked in, pretty probable, not absolutely certain, and some of them are quite disturbing. And then finally, there are all these low-risk, nasty tail risks in the system, and there are a lot of them. And most of them won't happen in this 10 years. But how much should we bet that none of them will? And we've already had 2 in this decade. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure listening to you. Thank you for enlightening us with the clarity of your exposition. Well, I think I'm optimistic. So a good conclusion could be the world is facing a lot of disasters, but almost all of them are not part of a scenario you consider is almost certain. That's true. Yes. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, the things I think are almost certain are manageable, and some of them are quite nice.
Okay, we have some questions,
okay,
and we can address them, and I think there are very interesting ones. I take my glasses, and I have them also here in my phone. So the first question says, it's a long question. The war in Ukraine, of course, the war in Ukraine should be always in the questions, has worsened the economic and political decoupling and the return to the bloc dynamics observed during the second part of the 20th century. In this new scenario, how can challenges like the environmental threat or a common corporate tax be addressed?
Okay, I think these are very different categories of threat, and since we've got little time, I will put this one to one. I will go through one issue fairly simply. Something like a common global corporation tax is essentially it's basically a problem for the open economies of the world, which are relatively free market economies, and nearly all of these are democracies. They're us, basically. Companies are not going to flee to China to avoid corporation tax. The issues are much too big for that, right? So we can do that. This is an OECD issue, ultimately, and countries which are very dependent on the OECD, tax havens. So that's not a problem. We can fix that. We can't do global trade negotiations. I think they're dead. That's really important. But we can do them among ourselves, and I've touched upon that in the deglobalization. Climate change is, well, there are two really big ones. One, of course, is security, peace. We can't do peace without being able to manage in some way the relations between the blocs. And it has to be said, I regard the interlocutors on the other side, above all Russia, as far more dangerous. Putin's Russia is incomparably more dangerous than the Soviet Union was, because it's led by really led by one person who I think has become a lunatic. Now, that was true under Stalin, but Stalin didn't have nuclear bombs for very long, thank heavens. So this is more dangerous. And on climate, you need China. China is far and away the biggest emitter, incomparably. It is far and away it is going to generate most of the growth in emissions for the next 10, 15 years. Without China, there is absolute, the EU and Europe generates 10% of world emissions. You can eliminate it, totally zero. And the growth in the rest of the world will ensure that global emissions rise. What happens here is irrelevant. It's all about the emerging and developed countries. I don't know how that's going to work now. I really don't. The only plus is the Chinese leadership has generally proved relatively rational on such things, and they do understand their own interest. And we've got to try. There's no alternative.
Oh, dramatic.
Yeah. I've long believed that the climate change is an existential threat for us, and we're not going to be able to rise to it. I hope I got that point over.
Okay. Well, there's a second question. What countries or regions should do better in the future if deglobalization and political risks are the new normal?
Well, regions that can organize themselves around big, stable economies, and therefore will have the benefit of a large amount of economies of scale, scope, and so forth within the region, will do best. So North America and Europe, if they manage to sustain this, and even better if they manage to combine, including Japan. If there's a genuine free trade agreement of the whole developed world and with a lot of other countries in it, they should be able to do reasonably well. They're reasonably balanced, and they're still about half the world economy, as I said. China can certainly survive this environment, particularly in alliance with Russia, which supplies many of its raw materials, and other countries around it which are dependent on the Chinese market. So a Chinese region is, I think, going to be potentially pretty well, though there'll be friction. India has the potential to do this, particularly if, as I think it will, becomes close to the West. I am very concerned exactly how in this world it will work for Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, but they could, in theory, you imagine, be a bit in both. So I think this is a world where we will lose some opportunities, but unless we go completely crazy, it's manageable. But it will be around, I think, a Chinese-centered bloc. It will be a mess at the margin. Asia, a question about India, where it ends up, and it will be about North America and Western Europe. They are the core of the world economy, and for the next 10, 20 years, they will continue to be.
Okay.
I think it's time for one more.
And Latin America?
What?
Latin America.
Well, Latin America's opportunity, I think it's a genuine opportunity, is to be part of both the North American and European bloc and the Chinese, because it supplies things that the Chinese really need. The problem for Latin America is the development of China deindustrialized it. And the result is that they've been pushed back, and this is terrible, into commodity specialization, and that doesn't generate and has never generated completely sustainable and widely shared growth. And the failure of some countries, which I really believed had high potential to go into rapid industrialization, most notably Brazil, but also to a degree Mexico, is really depressing. So I expect them more of the same. But I hope I'm wrong. But I think there are deep reasons why it's been the least successful region. You know, in 1960, most people thought Latin America would be an immensely successful region, and they thought Asia, Gunnar Myrdal's famous Asian drama, was ruined, finished. Well, that was seriously wrong. By the way, that would strongly suggest that even my probabilities will turn out to be wrong. But we don't know, and there's a puzzle, but I don't see anything happening there to change the trend, alas.
Mm-hmm. Third question.
It's up to Spain to fix this.
Third question. We are seeing populism rising, not only in emerging markets, but in Europe as well. Is democracy under serious threat in the world?
I think that's a very good answer. Quick answer to that is yes, obviously. Just look at what's going on. But we've had some good things. Macron won. We had some bad things. 42% of French people voted for a neo-fascist, sorry. And Donald Trump is the most likely next president of the United States. Just think about that. On the other hand, I think, as I wrote in my column this week, the Russians and the Chinese are sort of proving the problems with one-man rule. I do say one man, it's always a man. So the complete one-man rule leads to really, really crazy decisions. So I think democracy is in real trouble, but so is autocracy, which is just another way of saying we're in real trouble. You know, these people are saying you've got to stop.
We have 1 minute for one question.
Well, it's your program. You can do whatever you like.
Well, let's look somewhere else. We have a very important question here. How do you assess the risk of social distress, especially in countries already in debt distress? You refer
of social distress.
Social distress in countries with debt distress. You refer to the debt
I think
situation.
it's not a risk. That's pretty close to a certainty. I put debt problems in the probable. When I say probable, I mean sort of 80% probable. We have a lot of well, first, a lot of developing countries that are going to go through default now, with the oil prices, the energy, COVID, the energy prices, and the food prices. They're going to have to choose between servicing their debt and importing food, right? What is any sane government going to do? It's going to default and import food, and rightly. So there are going to be a lot of defaults in non-commodity exporting countries. But the oil exporters are fine. And this war is a war in the world's breadbasket. So that's going to be certain. A lot of countries, as I pointed out, are more indebted than ever, including a lot of low-income countries. And so I'm very concerned about the low-income countries, Africa, also some in Asia. And we're going to have, and I wrote a big column on the basis of a World Bank report under Carmen Reinhardt, who's now chief economist at the World Bank. We must regard debt problems in developing and emerging countries as certain, but I'm absolutely sure you guys know more about this than I do, because that's your bread and butter. I hope I'm wrong for your sakes, but I would be very surprised in this case. Now, the really interesting question about this, which I did touch on in my column this week, is how, given the immense role of China as a creditor of emerging developing countries, these debt negotiations are going to be done. Because at the moment, as I understand it, I'm not an expert, you know much more than I do, but as I understand it, there is effectively no mechanism for doing this. But according to the IMF data, which I didn't realize till I put it in my column, the total debt of emerging and developing countries, particularly to China, is now the same size as its debt to the entire Paris Club. I'm sure you all knew this, I didn't, and that says That we can't write down our debt and just let the Chinese get away with it, can we? That would be ridiculous. And the Chinese will see the worst. So if we can't cooperate, this is going to be a colossal mess. And as far as nobody's really getting there, and of course relations with China are now so terrible, it will be difficult. So we not only we're going to have the debt problems, but we don't know how to manage them. I'm not even going to talk about developed country debt because that gets us into other problems, and I might have to discuss the question of debt defaults in the Eurozone, and I really don't want to talk about that.
Well, it's
not here, of course.
It's very significant that 26 countries in Africa haven't condemned the Ukraine attack in United Nations.
Of course, of course.
Of course.
Of course. This is not a time to make enemies.
Well, it was really a pleasure. Time's run out, and we thank you very much again.
I'm sorry I couldn't be more cheerful.
Your brilliant presentation. Thank you so much.
A pleasure.